Maria Santos slammed her palm against the glass display case so hard that two customers near the door turned around in alarm. Her breathing was fast, her eyes locked on a small gold pendant resting on a velvet cushion inside the case, shaped like a tiny sun with 3 small dents pressed into its surface. "That pendant belongs to my son," she said, her voice cracking. "Someone tell me right now where that came from." The man standing beside the case turned to face her. He was tall, dressed in a dark gray coat, and half the people in the store recognized him immediately. His name was Richard Ashford, one of the wealthiest men in the country, and he was holding a small velvet box containing the very pendant Maria was pointing at. Already purchased, already wrapped. "Ma'am, I think there has been some kind of mistake," Richard said calmly, though something in the woman's face made the words feel hollow even as he said them. "There is no mistake," Maria said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know every mark on that pendant. 3 dents, pressed in by his father with a nail, because we couldn't afford a real engraving. 3 dents for 3 birthdays before he disappeared. Turn it over. There's a small chip on the back edge. He dropped it once at school, and it hit a rock." A security guard named Kevin stepped forward and reached for Maria's arm. "Ma'am, please step back from the case." "Wait," Richard said sharply, raising his hand before Kevin could touch her. "Just wait." The store had gone silent. A young couple near the window had stopped browsing rings to watch. The store manager, a nervous man named Peter Hollis, hovered by the counter, unsure whether to call the police or apologize to his most valuable customer. Nobody moved. Richard looked down at the velvet box in his hand, then back up at Maria's face. There was something in her eyes that hit him harder than anything a stranger had ever said to him before. It was not anger, it was grief, the kind that never fully heals, the kind that waits quietly in the corners of a person's life until something reminds it that it is still there. "Why 3 birthdays?" Richard asked slowly. "Why not just say it looks similar to something your son once had?" "Because I know that pendant," Maria said. "I picked it out myself. I know every scratch on it. Turn it over, and you will see the chip I am talking about." Richard's jaw tightened. He turned the velvet box over, opened it, and looked at the back edge of the tiny gold sun. There, exactly as she described, was a small chip in the metal. His hands began to tremble slightly, in a way that people who worked for him would never have believed possible. He had never told anyone about that chip. He had asked the jeweler who cleaned it every year, an old craftsman named Walter Higgins, never to mention it, because the boy who owned this pendant had once cried for an entire evening after noticing it, afraid it made the pendant less special. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly quiet. "I did not get it anywhere," Maria said, confused. "I am telling you, it is mine. It belongs to my son." "I need you to explain everything to me," Richard said. "Not the police, not security. You and me. 5 minutes. Because if what you are saying is true, I may be holding something that is about to change both of our lives." Peter Hollis stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Ashford, I am terribly sorry for this disturbance. I can have her removed immediately." "No one is removing anyone," Richard said, his tone sharp enough to make Peter freeze mid-step. "Give us a private room, now." Kevin the guard looked back and forth between Richard and Maria, unsure whether he was protecting the store from her or protecting her from being thrown out onto the street. Maria wiped her face with her sleeve, still staring at the pendant as though it might vanish if she blinked. "You believe me?" she asked quietly. Richard did not answer right away. He looked at the pendant again, turning it slowly in the light, and thought about a small boy who had entered his life 8 years earlier, silent and terrified, clutching this exact pendant so tightly that no one could pry it from his fingers for nearly 2 weeks. A boy the adoption agency had told him had no family left, no relatives searching for him anywhere. A boy Richard had raised as his own son and loved more than anything in the world. "I do not know what to believe yet," Richard finally said, "but I know you are not lying, and I think we both deserve to find out the truth." Peter Hollis quickly led them to a small private office behind the main showroom, usually reserved for wealthy clients discussing custom orders. Richard closed the door and gestured for Maria to sit, though she stayed standing, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her own body together. "Please," Richard said gently, "sit. Tell me about your son." Maria lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands still shaking. She looked at the pendant sitting on the table between them, and, for a moment, could not speak at all. Then, slowly, the words began to come. "His name is Daniel," she said. "He would be 14 now, brown hair, always a little too long because I could never afford to take him for haircuts often enough. A small scar above his eyebrow from falling off his bicycle when he was 4. He loved trains. He drew them on every piece of paper he could find, even on the walls once, which got him into trouble, but I never had the heart to be truly angry with him for it." Richard listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her face. 8 years ago," Maria continued, "I took him to the park near our apartment on a Sunday. It was the only day off I had that week after a stretch of double shifts at the diner where I worked. He was playing on the swings while I sat on a bench about 30 feet away. I looked down for 1 second to answer my phone. When I looked up, he was gone." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I searched everywhere," Maria said. "I screamed his name until my throat felt like it was tearing apart. Strangers helped me search the whole park, then the streets around it. Police arrived within 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. They searched for weeks, months. No camera caught a clear picture. No witness remembered anything useful. It was like the ground had simply opened up and swallowed him whole." "I am so sorry," Richard said quietly. "Everyone was sorry," Maria said, a bitter edge entering her voice for the first time. "After 2 years, the case went cold. After 4 years, they stopped actively looking. I kept searching on my own. I spent every spare dollar on private investigators who mostly took my money and gave nothing back. I put up flyers until the paper wore thin from being handled so many times. I never stopped believing he was alive somewhere. A mother knows. I do not care how impossible that sounds. I knew my son was still breathing somewhere in this world." Richard picked up the pendant from the table and held it gently in his palm, as though it had suddenly become the most fragile object he had ever touched. "I need to tell you something," he said slowly, his voice unsteady in a way that surprised even him. "And I need you to stay as calm as you can while I say it, because I am not entirely calm myself right now." Maria's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. 8 years ago, Richard began, I adopted a 6-year-old boy. I had just lost my wife, and I had always wanted children, though circumstances had made that impossible for us before she passed. The agency told me he had been found alone, with no family that could be located anywhere. He would not speak for the first month I had him. He would not let go of a small gold pendant, no matter what anyone tried. Maria's hands flew to her mouth, and the room seemed to tilt sideways around her. "What did you name him?" she whispered. Richard looked at her, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, his own eyes filled with tears. "Tell me," Maria said again, barely able to breathe. "Please, what is his name?" Richard opened his mouth to answer, but before a single word could leave him, there was a sharp knock at the office door, and Peter Hollis's voice came through, tight with urgency. "Mr. Ashford, I am so sorry to interrupt, but there is a call for you. It is your housekeeper. She says it is about your son, and she says it cannot wait." Maria's whole body went rigid. Richard stared at the closed door, the pendant still clutched in his hand, and for a moment, neither of them moved at all. Richard answered the call with his hands shaking, and Maria watched every flicker of his expression change as he listened. He said very little, just short replies, his eyes darting toward her more than once as though checking that she was still real, still sitting there in front of him. When he finally lowered the phone, his face had gone pale. "That was Diane," he said. "She looks after my house and helps with my son when I am away. She said Ethan has not stopped drawing today. He drew the same picture over and over, a woman standing in a park, and when she asked him who it was, he said it was his mother, and that he had a feeling something important was going to happen." Maria pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. "Ethan," she repeated softly. "That is his name?" "That is the name I gave him," Richard said. "I had no idea what his name was before I met him. He would not speak for weeks. When he finally did, he never gave a full name, only fragments. I chose Ethan because it felt gentle, something that might help him feel safe." "His name is Daniel," Maria said, her voice breaking. "Daniel Santos." Richard nodded slowly, as though the two names were merging together in his mind into a single truth he could barely process. "I think," he said, "we need to go to him right now. Together." They walked out of the jewelry store side by side, Peter Hollis and Kevin watching from a respectful distance, neither one fully understanding what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. A black car waited outside, and Richard opened the door for Maria himself, something his driver would later say he had never seen him do for anyone. The ride to Richard's estate felt far longer than the actual 20 minutes it took. Maria sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the city blur past the window, without truly seeing any of it. Richard sat beside her in silence for a while, glancing at her occasionally, unsure what words could possibly fit a moment like this one. "Tell me about him," Maria finally said, breaking the quiet. "Tell me everything before I see him. I need to be ready." Richard exhaled slowly, gathering his thoughts. "When I first brought him home, he flinched at loud noises. Car horns, slamming doors, even raised voices on the television would make him jump. It took months before that stopped completely. When he finally spoke, his first full sentence was asking where his mother was." Maria closed her eyes, pressing a hand against her chest, as if trying to hold her own heart in place. "I told the agency what he said," Richard continued. "I told them he kept asking about someone he called Mama Maria. They told me it was common for children who had experienced trauma to invent comforting memories, sometimes blending real people with imagined ones. They said there was no record of any family, so I believed them. I was grieving my wife. I wanted so badly to give this child a stable home. I never imagined that somewhere across the city, a mother was searching for him every single day." "He was saying my name," Maria whispered. "He remembered me this whole time." "He never stopped," Richard said quietly. "Even now, some nights, he still says it to himself before falling asleep. I always assumed it was some fragment his mind created to cope with losing whatever family he had before me. I never imagined it was real. I never imagined I was standing between a mother and her son without knowing it." "You did not know," Maria said, turning to look at him. "You could not have known. Please, do not carry guilt for something that was not your fault." "I appreciate you saying that," Richard replied, "but I suspect I will carry some of it anyway." The car slowed as it approached a set of tall iron gates, then rolled up a long driveway lined with old trees, finally stopping in front of a large stone house that looked more like something from a magazine than a place where an actual family lived. Richard stepped out first and offered Maria his hand, helping her from the car. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, as though the ground itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. Diane stood waiting near the front entrance, wiping her hands on an apron, clearly surprised to see Richard back so early. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "is everything all right?" "Diane," Richard said, "where is Ethan?" "In the study, still working on his drawings," Diane replied, glancing curiously at the unfamiliar woman standing beside her employer. "Is something wrong?" "Everything is about to change," Richard said quietly. "Please give us a moment alone with him." Diane's confusion was obvious, but she stepped aside without argument, sensing from Richard's tone that this was not a moment to ask questions. Richard led Maria down a long hallway lined with paintings and framed photographs, past a library filled with books she would never have imagined existing in someone's actual home, until they reached a set of tall double doors near the back of the house. He paused there, his hand resting on the handle, and turned to look at her. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Maria's whole body trembled, tears already sliding freely down her face. "I have been ready for 8 years," she said. Richard opened the door. Inside, a boy sat at a large wooden desk near the window, hunched over a sheet of paper, carefully sketching the outline of a train with a pencil gripped tightly in his hand. He had grown taller than the 6-year-old Maria remembered, his brown hair falling slightly across his forehead, and yet the moment her eyes landed on him, she knew with absolute certainty that this was her son. The boy looked up at the sound of the door opening. His eyes found Richard's familiar face first, then slowly shifted toward the woman standing beside him. For a moment, nothing happened at all. He simply stared, his pencil frozen mid-stroke against the paper, his chest rising and falling, as though something inside him had already sensed the truth before his mind had caught up to it. Maria took one small, trembling step into the room, her breath catching in her throat, and the boy's eyes widened as recognition began to break slowly across his face. The boy's hand slowly lowered the pencil onto the desk, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. He rose from his chair as though moving through water, each step slow and uncertain, his whole body trembling. "Mama," he said, so quietly the word almost dissolved into the silence of the room. Maria's legs nearly gave out beneath her. "Yes," she said, tears pouring freely now. "Yes, baby, it is me. It is Mama." The boy crossed the room in a few uneven strides and threw his arms around her waist, burying his face against her, his shoulders shaking as sobs broke free from somewhere deep inside him, years of unspoken memory finally finding release. Maria wrapped her arms around him and held on as though she would never let go again, whispering his name over and over, feeling the shape of him, the weight of him, the reality of him, after 8 long years of only holding on to hope. Richard stood near the door, watching the reunion unfold in front of him, tears sliding down his own face without any attempt to stop them. He had built an empire, negotiated deals worth more money than most people would see in 100 lifetimes, and stood in boardrooms without flinching, yet nothing in his life had ever moved him the way this single moment did. "I remembered you," the boy said, pulling back just enough to look at her face, his hands still gripping her sleeves as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. "I told everyone I remembered you, but nobody believed me. They said I was imagining it." "I believe you," Maria said, cupping his face in her hands. "I never stopped looking for you, not for one single day." Richard cleared his throat softly, and both of them turned toward him. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we have a great deal to figure out. But right now, nothing else in this world matters more than this moment." The boy looked between the two adults, confusion and joy mingling on his young face. "Are you my mom's friend now?" he asked Richard. Richard managed a small, tearful smile. "I think we are about to become something like family, one way or another," he said. "But first, let us just be grateful your mother found you." What none of them yet understood, standing together in that quiet study, while the afternoon light stretched long shadows across the lawn outside, was that this reunion had only uncovered the surface of something far larger, something buried inside the very agency that had placed Ethan into Richard's home 8 years earlier, a secret that was about to unravel in ways none of them could have predicted. That evening, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep on the couch beside his mother, exhausted from crying and laughing in equal measure, Richard sat across from Maria in his study, with a legal notepad in front of him, and a look of quiet determination on his face. "I need to understand exactly how this happened," he said. "Not for my sake, for every other family this agency may have hurt without anyone realizing it." Maria looked at him carefully. "You think there were others?" "I think," Richard said slowly, "that a boy does not simply appear out of nowhere with no family and no history. Someone created that story. Someone decided your son had no mother searching for him, when the truth was the opposite. I intend to find out who made that decision, and why." He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used outside of business emergencies. "Henry," he said when the call connected, "I need you at my house first thing tomorrow morning. Bring everything you can find on Bright Horizons Family Services. I do not care what it costs or how many people we need to hire. I need the truth." On the other end of the line, his longtime lawyer and closest friend, Henry Caldwell, sat up straight in his chair, sensing immediately from Richard's tone that something extraordinary had happened. "I will be there," Henry said. "Richard, are you all right?" Richard looked across the room at Maria, who was gently brushing hair away from her sleeping son's forehead, and felt something settle inside him that had been missing for a very long time. "I am better than all right," Richard said quietly, "but I need help making sure this never happens to another family again." He ended the call and sat in silence for a moment, watching Maria and her son, and understood that whatever came next, his life had already changed in ways he could never undo, and he would not have wanted to undo them even if he could. Later that night, after Maria had carried Ethan up to one of the guest bedrooms and tucked him in, she stood in the doorway for a long while, simply watching him sleep, afraid that if she looked away even for a moment, the whole day might reveal itself as nothing more than an elaborate dream. Richard found her there, leaning quietly against the frame of the door, and did not say anything at first, only stood beside her, sharing the silence. "I keep thinking I am going to wake up," Maria whispered eventually. 8 years of waking up to an empty apartment, and now this. Some part of me is still waiting for it to disappear. "It will not disappear," Richard said. "I promise you that." "You cannot promise something like that," Maria said, though there was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion mixed with a fragile kind of hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. "No," Richard admitted, "but I can promise that whatever happens next, I am not going to let anyone or anything take him from you again. Not the agency, not the courts, not anyone. Whatever needs to be done, legally or otherwise, I will make sure of it." Maria turned to look at him properly for the first time since they had left the jewelry store, seeing past the expensive coat and the recognizable face from magazine covers to the man underneath, someone who had also lost people he loved, someone who understood grief in his own quiet way. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked. "You could have handed him back and walked away. Legally, you probably could have made this far more complicated for me than it has been." "Because he is my son too," Richard said simply, "not by blood, but in every way that has mattered for the last 8 years. And because somewhere out there, other families may be living through exactly what you lived through, not knowing their children are only a few miles away, wondering why no one ever found them. I cannot undo what happened to you, but I can make sure it does not keep happening to others." Maria studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding settling over her features. "Then we do this together," she said. "Whatever it takes." Richard extended his hand, and Maria shook it, though the gesture felt more like the beginning of something far deeper than a simple agreement between two strangers, thrown together by circumstance. The following morning, before Henry Caldwell arrived, Richard sat with Ethan at the kitchen table, while Maria showered and changed into clothes Diane had quietly arranged to have brought over from a nearby store, since Maria had left home the previous day with nothing but the clothes on her back, and no idea her entire world was about to be rearranged. "Do you remember much from before?" Richard asked gently, watching the boy push scrambled eggs around his plate without much interest. "Before you came to live with me?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his young face working through thoughts too complicated for a boy his age to fully untangle. "Sometimes," he said finally, "mostly just feelings, like being scared, and a park. I always remembered a park, but I could never remember why it felt important." "That is where you were with your mother," Richard said carefully, "the day everything happened." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Was I taken? Like, actually taken? By someone?" Richard hesitated, unsure how much detail was appropriate for a child his age, and settled on something honest but gentle. "We do not know all the details yet," he said. "But somehow, information about your family was lost, or hidden, and because of that, no one realized your mother had never stopped looking for you. We are working on figuring out exactly what happened, so that we understand it fully, and so it never happens to another child." Ethan absorbed this slowly, his young mind clearly working through implications that were far too large for him to fully process all at once. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked quietly. "My mom. Is she going to be okay?" "She has been strong for 8 years," Richard said. "I think she is going to be more than okay, especially now that she has you back." Ethan managed a small smile at that, the first genuine smile Richard had seen from him since the previous afternoon's overwhelming reunion. Henry Caldwell arrived at the estate before 8 the next morning, carrying a leather bag full of folders and a laptop under his arm. He had worked with Richard for nearly 15 years, and had never once seen him look the way he looked that morning, tired and focused at the same time, as though sleep had barely mattered compared to the urgency in his chest. "Tell me everything you found," Richard said, closing the study door behind them while Maria sat with Ethan in the kitchen, helping him with breakfast, trying to give the boy some sense of normal morning routine despite everything swirling around them. "Bright Horizons Family Services shut down 4 years ago," Henry said, opening his laptop. "Officially, they closed due to funding issues, but I made some calls last night to a few contacts who still track adoption agency records for the state. There were complaints filed against them in the 2 years before they closed. Multiple complaints, actually, from birth parents claiming their children had been placed for adoption without their knowledge or consent. Richard's jaw tightened. Why was nothing done? Most of the complaints were dismissed for lack of evidence, Henry said. Paperwork looked clean on the surface, but one name kept appearing across several of the complaint files. A caseworker named Nancy Doyle. She handled intake for children who arrived without clear family records, which meant she had significant control over how those cases were documented. Where is she now? Still in the city, as far as I can tell, Henry said. She works at a smaller agency now, a place called Willow Creek Placement Services. I have not made contact with her directly. I thought you would want to decide how to handle that. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out over the lawn where Ethan had been playing just days earlier, unaware that his entire history had been quietly rewritten by someone he had never met. I want a professional involved, he said. Someone who investigates this kind of thing for a living. I do not want to make a mistake that lets her destroy evidence or disappear. Henry nodded. I know someone. Detective Laura Bennett handles cases involving fraud in child placement systems. She used to work for the state before going independent. She has the right connections to make this move quickly and carefully. Call her, Richard said. Today. While they waited for Laura Bennett to arrive, Henry continued digging through everything he could find on Nancy Doyle's professional history. She had worked at Bright Horizons for nearly 9 years before it closed, moving up from an entry-level intake assistant to a senior caseworker with broad authority over how difficult cases were documented and processed. Her personnel file, obtained through a contact who still had access to old state archives, showed 2 prior internal warnings for what the agency vaguely described as documentation irregularities, both of which had apparently been resolved quietly, without any external reporting. That is the part that concerns me most, Henry said, showing Richard the file on his laptop screen. If the agency itself flagged irregularities internally and did nothing beyond a private warning, either they did not understand the scale of what she was doing, or someone above her chose to look the other way. Or benefited from it, Richard said grimly. That is possible too, Henry admitted. Placement fees for hard-to-place children can be substantial, especially when an agency can claim a case involved significant effort to locate any family. If a caseworker manufactured cases where children appeared untraceable when they were not, that would justify higher fees, faster placements, and better statistics for the agency's own funding reports. Richard closed his eyes briefly, thinking of Ethan sitting quietly in the next room, unaware that his entire early childhood had potentially been treated as a line item in someone's funding report. How many children are we talking about, potentially? I do not know yet, Henry said. That is exactly what Laura Bennett specializes in uncovering. Maria, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, stepped further into the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I want to be involved in whatever comes next, she said, not sitting on the sidelines while other people decide what happens. I spent 8 years being told there was nothing more anyone could do. I am done being told to wait quietly. You will be involved, Richard said. Every step. Laura Bennett arrived at the estate by early afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had seen difficult cases before and knew how to handle them without losing her composure. She sat with Richard, Henry, and Maria around the study table, listening carefully as Maria described the day Daniel disappeared from the park, and as Richard explained everything the agency had told him 8 years earlier. This matches a pattern I have seen before, Laura said once they finished. Children reported as abandoned or found alone, when in reality they had families searching for them. Usually there is a financial motive. Some agencies received placement fees for hard-to-place children, and a caseworker with the right access could manufacture a case where none should exist, especially if the child was too young or too traumatized to clearly explain what had happened to them. Are you saying this was not an isolated incident? Maria asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. I am saying we need to find out, Laura replied. If Nancy Doyle did this once, there is a strong chance she did it more than once. I want to look into every case she handled during her time at Bright Horizons. If there are other children out there whose families were told they were untraceable, we need to find them. Richard felt a chill move through him at the thought. How do we get access to those records? Some are still on file with the state, even though the agency closed, Laura said. Others may exist only in whatever personal records Nancy Doyle kept for herself, which is common in cases like this, because caseworkers sometimes keep private notes to protect themselves if questions ever arise. I want to approach her directly but carefully. If she senses she is under suspicion too early, she may destroy anything incriminating before we can secure it. Over the following days, Laura worked quietly, pulling old adoption records from the state archive and cross-referencing names, dates, and case numbers. Henry worked alongside her, using his legal contacts to request documents through official channels, while avoiding anything that might alert Nancy Doyle to the investigation. Richard, meanwhile, arranged for a private DNA test for Ethan and Maria, wanting undeniable proof before moving forward with anything that might affect the boys' legal status. The results came back 5 days later. Henry read them aloud in the study, while Maria sat gripping Ethan's hand tightly, and Richard stood near the window with his arms crossed, though his eyes were fixed entirely on the two of them. "There is a near certainty of a biological match," Henry said quietly. "Maria Santos is confirmed as Ethan's biological mother." Maria let out a breath she had seemingly been holding for 8 years, pulling her son into her arms and pressing a kiss to the top of his head. Ethan, who had grown increasingly comfortable calling her mama over the past several days, wrapped his arms around her without hesitation. "Now we have everything we need," Richard said quietly, "legally and otherwise." 3 days after the DNA results were confirmed, Laura Bennett called an urgent meeting at Richard's estate. Her expression, usually calm and measured, carried a tension that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "I found something," she said, opening a folder and spreading several documents across the table. Nancy Doyle did not act alone. There is a paper trail connecting her to a man named Paul Whitfield, who was the director of Bright Horizons at the time. Together, they appear to have handled at least 6 other cases with the exact same pattern, children reported as abandoned or untraceable, when in fact, there were birth parents actively searching for them. The room went silent. Maria's hand tightened around Ethan's, though the boy, sensing the seriousness in the adults' voices, had gone quiet and watchful, looking between them with wide eyes. "6 other children," Richard said slowly. "Are any of them still unaccounted for?" "Some were placed locally, through other agencies, using falsified records," Laura said. "I believe we can trace most of them if we move quickly. But there is a problem. Nancy Doyle appears to have found out that questions are being asked. One of my contacts at the State Archive mentioned that someone matching her description requested access to old case files 2 days ago, right around the time we began pulling records ourselves." "She is trying to cover her tracks," Henry said. "Exactly," Laura replied. "If she destroys her private notes, or convinces Paul Whitfield to do the same, we may lose the only concrete evidence that ties them directly to these placements. I want to move on this immediately, before either of them has the chance to disappear or destroy what we need." Richard stood, his expression hardening into the same focused determination he brought to his most difficult business decisions, except now the stakes were far more personal. "What do you need from me?" "Legal authorization to move quickly, and enough resources to track both of them today," Laura said. "I already have someone watching Willow Creek Placement Services where Nancy Doyle currently works. If she tries to leave the city, I want to know within minutes, not hours." "You have whatever you need," Richard said. "Money is not a concern. Time is." Laura's phone buzzed only 20 minutes later. She answered immediately, her expression sharpening as she listened. "She just left the office early," she said, lowering the phone. "My contact says she looked rushed, carrying a bag she does not normally bring to work. She is heading toward the parking structure now." "She is running," Henry said. "She thinks she can disappear before we connect the pieces," Laura said, already grabbing her coat. "I am not going to let that happen. I have people positioned nearby, and local authorities are aware of the situation, but I need eyes on her the moment she leaves that building." Richard stood as well. "I am coming with you." "Richard, that is not necessary," Laura said firmly. "Let the professionals handle this part." "With respect," Richard said, "she took something from a mother that can never fully be replaced, and she may have done it to other families as well. I am not asking for permission. I am telling you I am coming." Laura studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Stay in the car. Whatever happens, you stay in the car." Maria reached out and grabbed Richard's sleeve before he could leave the room. "Please be careful," she said. "Ethan cannot lose another parent." Richard looked down at her, something steady passing between them. "I will be careful," he said. "I promise." The drive to Willow Creek Placement Services took 20 tense minutes, made worse by afternoon traffic that seemed determined to slow them at every turn. Laura kept in constant contact with the officer already positioned near the parking structure, her voice calm but clipped as she coordinated movements over the phone. "She is still in the structure," Laura said, glancing back at Richard in the passenger seat behind her. "My contact says she seems to be waiting for someone." "Paul Whitfield," Henry said from beside Richard. "She may be trying to coordinate with him before either of them leaves the city." They arrived just as a gray sedan pulled slowly out of the parking structure, hesitating at the exit, as though the driver was unsure which direction to take. Laura's car stopped a short distance away, close enough to observe without drawing attention. "That is her," Laura said, watching the sedan carefully. "She is not moving. I think she is waiting for confirmation that no one is watching." A second car approached from the opposite direction, slowing as it neared the gray sedan. Laura's eyes narrowed. "That is Whitfield's vehicle. They are meeting right here, in the open." Local officers Laura had coordinated with moved in quickly and quietly, blocking both vehicles before either driver had the chance to react. Richard watched from the car, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, as officers approached the two vehicles and asked both drivers to step outside. Nancy Doyle emerged from her car with a bag clutched tightly against her chest, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as she realized the scale of what was happening around her. Paul Whitfield, a heavy-set man in his 60s, stood beside his own car with his hands raised slightly, clearly recognizing that whatever explanation he might offer would not be believed. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions regarding your former employment at Bright Horizons Family Services," one of the officers said to Nancy, his tone firm but professional. "We also need to look inside that bag." Nancy's face went pale. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. Laura stepped forward, showing her credentials. "We have documentation connecting you to at least 6 falsified adoption cases over a 4-year period," she said calmly. "I would strongly suggest cooperating, because the alternative will only make things more difficult for you." Nancy's shoulders slumped, the bag slipping slightly in her grip as the reality of the situation settled over her. Inside that bag, officers would later find a set of private notebooks containing detailed records of every case she had manipulated, records she had planned to destroy before anyone could connect them to her directly. Richard remained in the car as instructed, watching the scene unfold with a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief, because the truth was finally coming to light. Heartbreak, because 6 other families were about to learn that a similar nightmare had been done to them as well. "It is over," Henry said quietly beside him. "No," Richard replied, watching as officers guided Nancy Doyle toward a waiting vehicle. "This is only the beginning. Now we have to find every family this happened to, and give them back what was taken from them." In the weeks that followed, the notebooks recovered from Nancy Doyle's bag turned out to be exactly the evidence Laura Bennett had hoped for. Each page contained handwritten details of cases she and Paul Whitfield had manipulated together, dates, names, and small notes about which families had been the easiest to convince that their children could not be found. Reading through them, Henry Caldwell said it was some of the most damning evidence he had encountered in his entire career, because Nancy had unknowingly documented her own guilt in careful, dated handwriting. 6 families were identified from those notebooks. Detective Laura Bennett worked with state officials to track down each one, a slow and delicate process, because some of the children involved had since been placed in adoptive homes far from where they were originally taken. 2 of the children were found living only a few hours away, both now old enough to remember fragments of their early childhood, both reunited with birth parents who had never stopped hoping. A third case proved more painful, as the birth mother involved had passed away 2 years earlier, never learning the truth about what had happened to her child, though her surviving family was finally given answers and allowed to build a relationship with the child she had lost. Maria attended 2 of the reunions personally, standing quietly to the side as other mothers experienced the same overwhelming relief she had felt in Richard's study. She found herself crying just as hard for strangers as she had cried for her own son, understanding now, more than most people ever could, exactly what those mothers were feeling in that moment. "I know this pain," she told one mother, a woman named Susan Marsh who had spent 6 years searching for her daughter after a nearly identical disappearance. "And I know this joy too. Both of them stay with you. But the joy is stronger. It always will be." Nancy Doyle and Paul Whitfield faced serious legal consequences for what they had done, formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and falsifying official records, among other charges related to the illegal placement scheme they had run together for years. The case drew significant media attention, partly because of Richard Ashford's involvement, and partly because the story itself, a mother and a billionaire's adopted son turning out to be the same family, captured public attention in a way few legal cases ever did. Within days of the arrests becoming public knowledge, reporters began gathering outside the gates of Richard's estate, hoping for a comment, a photograph, anything that might help them tell the story first. Maria, unaccustomed to this kind of attention, found herself overwhelmed the first morning she saw a line of cameras waiting near the driveway. "I do not know how to do this," she admitted to Richard, watching from an upstairs window as a reporter attempted to interview Diane, who politely declined and closed the gate intercom without another word. "I have spent 8 years trying to get anyone to pay attention to my son's case, and now that they finally are, I feel like I cannot breathe." "You do not have to speak to any of them if you do not want to," Richard said. "Henry can issue a statement on our behalf, and we can request privacy for Ethan's sake while the legal process continues. But if speaking helps other families come forward," Maria said slowly, "then maybe I should say something. Maybe my silence for 8 years was part of why nobody connected the pieces sooner." In the end, Maria agreed to a single, carefully prepared statement, delivered from the estate's front steps, with Henry standing beside her, and Richard just out of frame, present, but deliberately not the center of attention. She spoke plainly about the day Daniel disappeared, about the years of searching, and about her hope that any other family who suspected something similar might have happened to them would reach out to Detective Bennett's office. She did not mention Richard's wealth, or the drama of the jewelry store encounter, focusing instead on the simple truth that a mother had found her son, and that truth alone was enough to hold the public's attention for weeks. The legal proceedings against Nancy Doyle and Paul Whitfield moved slowly, as such cases often do, but eventually reached trial nearly a year after the arrests outside Willow Creek Placement Services. Maria was asked to testify, along with 2 of the other birth parents identified through the recovered notebooks. She sat in the witness stand, her hands steady despite the nervous energy she felt, and told the same story she had told Richard in that small jewelry store office, the park, the swings, the phone call that had lasted only 1 second too long, and the 8 years that followed. Nancy Doyle sat at the defense table throughout the testimony, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, never once looking up to meet Maria's gaze. When it came time for the defense to question her, their lawyer attempted to suggest that record-keeping errors, rather than deliberate fraud, explained the discrepancies in Daniel's case file. Maria answered every question calmly, refusing to let anger creep into her voice, though Richard, seated in the gallery, found it far harder to keep his own composure in check. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days before returning guilty verdicts against both defendants, on the majority of charges brought against them. Paul Whitfield received a lengthy sentence given his role directing the scheme and profiting from the placement fees involved, while Nancy Doyle, who ultimately cooperated further once facing the weight of the evidence against her, received a somewhat reduced sentence in exchange for helping investigators locate records connected to 2 additional cases that had not yet been identified. Outside the courthouse, Maria stood on the steps beside Richard, Henry, and Laura Bennett, while Ethan waited nearby with Diane, old enough now to understand most of what had happened, but still shielded from the more difficult details of the proceedings. "It does not undo what happened," Maria said quietly, watching reporters pack up their equipment at the base of the steps. "Nothing can give me back those 8 years." "No," Richard agreed, "but it means no other mother has to spend 8 years not knowing why her child disappeared without a trace. That has to count for something." Maria nodded slowly, watching her son laugh at something Diane had said nearby, his face free of the wariness that had defined him during those first difficult months in Richard's home years earlier. "It counts for everything," she said. Richard, despite his usual preference for staying out of headlines, allowed the story to be told publicly, understanding that visibility might help other families who had experienced similar situations come forward. Within a month of the news breaking, 4 additional families reached out to Laura Bennett's office, believing their own children may have passed through the same corrupt system years earlier. Each case was reviewed carefully, and while not every lead resulted in a reunion, the investigation expanded into something far larger than anyone had initially expected, eventually leading state officials to review adoption placement practices at several other agencies as well. While the legal proceedings continued, Richard focused on something equally important, making sure that Ethan, whom Maria now called Daniel again in private moments, though the boy himself had grown attached to both names, felt secure and loved throughout a transition that could easily have become overwhelming and confusing for a child his age. "You do not have to choose between us," Richard told him one evening, sitting on the edge of the boy's bed, while Maria stood nearby, listening quietly. "Your mother is your mother, and nothing changes that. But I care about you very much too, and I am not going anywhere unless you want me to." "Can I still call you Dad sometimes?" Ethan asked quietly, glancing toward Maria as if worried the question might upset her. Maria knelt beside the bed and took her son's hand. "You can call him whatever feels right to you," she said gently. "Love is not something we need to ration. There is enough room in your heart for both of us, and enough room in ours for you." Ethan smiled for the first time that evening, a small but genuine smile that eased some of the tension that had been sitting in the room. "Okay," he said. "Then I want to call you Mom, and I want to keep calling him Dad, if that is okay." "That is more than okay," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. In the months that followed, Richard worked with Henry Caldwell to formalize a legal arrangement that protected Maria's rights as Daniel's biological mother, while also preserving the deep bond that had formed between Richard and the boy. Over 8 years of fatherhood, neither of them had chosen, but both had come to cherish completely. Rather than simply returning Daniel to Maria and stepping back from his life, Richard proposed something neither of them had initially expected. "I would like to help you both build a stable life together," Richard said to Maria one afternoon, sitting across from her in the same study where their lives had first collided weeks earlier. "Not out of guilt, though I admit some of that remains, but because I have grown to love this boy as my own son, and because I believe he deserves both of us in his life, not one or the other." Maria studied him carefully, searching his face for hidden motives she had learned to watch for after so many years of disappointment, but found only sincerity. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A home near mine, close enough that Daniel can move easily between both of our lives without disruption," Richard said. "Financial support so you never again have to work double shifts just to make ends meet. And most importantly, a real place in his life for both of us, built on honesty this time, not secrets." Maria was quiet for a long moment, memories of 8 lonely years passing behind her eyes. "I never wanted charity," she said finally. "I built a life on my own, even when it nearly broke me." "This is not charity," Richard said. "This is a family choosing to stay together, in whatever shape makes the most sense for the child at the center of it. Daniel does not need to lose the comfort he has known these past 8 years just because his mother has finally been found. And you do not need to lose a single day of the time that was stolen from you either. There is room for both of these truths to exist together." Maria finally nodded, tears gathering in her eyes again, though these tears felt different from the ones she had cried in the jewelry store weeks earlier. These were tears of something settling into place after years of being unable to settle at all. Over the following year, the new arrangement slowly became simply life, in the ordinary, comfortable way that even extraordinary circumstances eventually do. Maria moved into a comfortable home not far from Richard's estate, close enough that Daniel could walk between both houses on his own once he grew a little older, though for now, Richard's driver made the short trip several times a week without complaint. Maria returned to school part-time, something she had given up years earlier out of necessity, eventually training to become a counselor for families navigating experiences similar to her own, believing deeply that her story could help others find hope during their darkest moments. Richard, for his part, used a portion of his considerable resources to establish an oversight foundation dedicated to reviewing adoption placement practices across multiple agencies, hiring Laura Bennett to lead investigations into any organization showing patterns similar to what Nancy Doyle and Paul Whitfield had done at Bright Horizons. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped identify and correct several additional cases of falsified records, reuniting more families who had been told, wrongly, that their children could never be found. Daniel, who continued going by both names depending on which part of his life he was living in that moment, grew into a thoughtful, resilient teenager who eventually chose to study engineering, inspired partly by his childhood obsession with trains, and partly by a desire to build things that lasted, things that could not simply disappear the way his own childhood nearly had. He kept the gold pendant with him always, no longer as a source of comfort during unexplained fear, but as a reminder of everything that had been lost and everything that had eventually been found again. On the day of Daniel's 16th birthday, Maria and Richard stood together in the backyard of Richard's estate, watching him laugh with friends around a table filled with food neither household could have imagined affording separately just a few years earlier. Diane, still working as the household's devoted housekeeper, moved between guests, refilling drinks, smiling at how completely different this home felt compared to the quiet, careful silence that had filled it for so many years before Maria's arrival. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never finding each other?" Maria asked quietly, watching her son from a distance. "Every single day," Richard admitted. "If I had chosen a different jewelry store that afternoon, or arrived 10 minutes later, or earlier, everything might have stayed hidden forever." "But you did not," Maria said. "You were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there." Richard turned to look at her, something warm and steady passing between them, built not on the drama of that first chaotic encounter, but on years of shared devotion to the same remarkable child. "I used to believe things happened for reasons I could control," he said. "Money, decisions, careful planning. But nothing about that day in the jewelry store was something I planned or controlled. I have come to believe some things simply find their way back to where they belong, no matter how long it takes, or how impossible the odds seem." Daniel looked over from across the yard, catching sight of both parents watching him, and waved them over with an easy smile that held none of the fear or silence that had once defined him as a small boy clutching a pendant no one could take from his hands. Maria and Richard walked toward him together, side by side, two people who had once stood on opposite sides of an impossible tragedy and had somehow built, out of that same tragedy, an entirely unexpected kind of family. And as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the lawn, much as it had on the day of their very first reunion, Daniel wrapped one arm around his mother and the other around the man he now proudly called his father, standing between the two people who had given up everything, in their own ways, to make sure he never again had to wonder whether he was loved.